English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
In today's top stories here in Algiers, the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has received the Secretary General of the Workers' Party, Louisa Hanoun. More air raids were carried out today by the Israeli occupation army against the Gaza Strip, and more precisely, the territory's southern part, where thousands of civilians sought refuge. Negotiations at COP28 continue today with the hope that parties will deliver an ambitious agreement that sets the world on a path to a more sustainable future. Hello and welcome on Radio Algeria International. I'm Jamal Semeni. Here in Algiers, the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has received the Secretary General of the Workers' Party, Louisa Hanoun. In a statement made to the press following the meeting, the Workers' Party leader had the following.
We discussed crucial issues, first the genocide perpetrated against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank and its repercussions on the national and regional plans and its incidence on the international level. It is our responsibility as a country, a state and people to renew our unchanged commitments towards the Palestinian people, and then we address the domestic situation in all its aspects, political, democratic, and the social and economic situation, and also the situation in our African environment, and discussed how to prevent our country by tackling all outstanding problems so that our country could resist and stand against the world's changes and increasing crisis.
Earlier, President Tebboune received the head of the Youth Higher Council, Mustafa Hidawi. President Abdelmajid Tebboune today had a telephone conversation with the Crown Prince of Kuwait, Sheikh Mishal Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, during which he inquired about the state of health of Emir Nawaf Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah. President Tebboune expressed his wishes for the well-being, health and prosperity of the Emir and the people of Kuwait. The Crown Prince, for his part, expressed his gratitude to the President of the Republic and wished further development and progress to the Algerian people. Now, the Algerian Space Agency celebrated the 6th anniversary of the launch of the Algerian Alcomsat-1 telecommunications satellite in the presence of members of the government. For his part, the Minister for Communication, Mohamed Lagab, has called for the launch of other satellites with the aim of strengthening national security and sovereignty through the establishment of an appropriate, efficient and secure transmission network. Mr. Lagab said the following to reporters.
The sovereignty of information and the national security related information could not be achieved without our own satellite, specialized in the TV broadcast. I hope if these technical issues would take time to be settled to broadcast via Satellite 1, I prefer that we move directly to Satellite 2. I hope this could be achieved within months and not within years. The Algerian channels would broadcast through an Algerian satellite.
That was the Minister of Communication, Mohamed Lagab. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International. Now with Mariam Bershi, who will tell us about the situation in the besieged Gaza Strip.
More aid raids were carried out today by the Israeli army against the Gaza Strip, and more precisely the territory's southern part, where thousands of civilians sought refuge. Eyewitnesses were quoted by media as saying that the raids mainly hit the towns of Khan Yunis and Rafah in the southern part, of people fleeing the fighting in the territory's northern part have massed. At least 20 Palestinians were killed in the Israeli airstrikes, which hit a hospital, the last still functioning, in the northern part of Gaza. According to the Palestinian sources, scores of people have so far been killed in the fighting raging in the area, as well as in Gaza, in the neighboring refugee camp of Jabalia. The refugee camps of Nusayrat and Maghazi in the central part of Gaza have not been spared by the fighting. The UN affirmed that half of Gaza's houses had been destroyed or damaged by the war raging in Gaza for more than 2 months now. The Israeli all-out offensive on Gaza has caused the displacement of 1.9 million people, representing 85% of the population. Meanwhile, the UN General Assembly is holding a special session today devoted to the situation in the Gaza Strip. The meeting, convened by the Arab Group and by the Islamic Cooperation Organization, will discuss a draft resolution on the Israeli acts of aggression on Gaza and focus on the disastrous humanitarian situation prevailing in the territory. And now on the humanitarian situation in the biggest besieged Gaza Strip. During a briefing to Newsman, spokesperson for the Secretary-General Stefan Dujarric evoked the deteriorating situation due to the military operation launched by the occupation Israeli troops and gave details about the aid entering via the Rafah crossing point.
On Gaza, also Martin Griffiths, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, said today at the launch of the Global Humanitarian Overview in Doha that the situation in Gaza is bad and getting worse, while adding that the truce that was achieved last week was of great importance. He said that the efforts by humanitarian workers will be all the more important during the military operations happening in southern Gaza now. By last night, about 100 trucks carrying humanitarian supplies had entered from Egypt into Gaza, the same volume as in most days since the resumption of hostilities on December 1st. This is well below the daily average of about 500 truckloads, including fuel, and that was, of course, humanitarian and commercial, with the vast majority being commercial, that entered every working day prior to 7 October.
Mr. Dujarric said the increased amount of humanitarian aid was the bare minimum needed to prevent the collapse of critical services for the displaced people.
Over the weekend, a daily average of 150,000 litres of fuel entered from Egypt, up from a daily average of 67,000 litres the previous 3 days. The increased amount are bare minimum needed to prevent the collapse of critical services, including hospitals, ambulances, water and sanitation infrastructure, and shelters for internally displaced people. Additionally, on Sunday, nearly 45 tons of commercial cooking gas also entered from Egypt, the first such delivery since the resumption of hostilities. Multiple health facilities and personnel were attacked across the Gaza Strip over the weekend. They include the Al-Yaman As-Said Hospital and the Awalda Hospital in Jabalia camp.
Mr. Dujarric said the increased amount, that was the spokesperson for the Secretary-General Stefan Dujarric. And now dozens of Israeli terrorist settlers today broke into the compound of Al-Aqsa Mosque under heavy protection from the Israeli occupation forces. The extremist settlers, divided into groups, raided the Holy Islamic Mosque from El-Magharibiya Gate. The settlers performed Talmudic rituals in the eastern part of the mosque. This comes at the time as the Israeli occupation forces intensify measures against Palestinian civilians coming from Jerusalem to enter the mosque, inspecting their IDs and briefly detaining them. Back to you, Jamal.
Thank you, Mariam. And as you followed in our top stories, negotiations at COP28 continue today with the hope that parties will deliver an ambitious agreement that sets the world on a path to a more sustainable future. In a statement, COP28 Director General Majid El-Suwaidi said the following.
To get the most ambitious outcome possible. That's our singular goal. So we are not focused on those types of issues. We're focused on getting the most ambitious outcome possible, and our COP presidency will do whatever is needed to make sure that we get that outcome today, and we're focused on that, and I think that we can work to deliver that.
A draft text for a COP28 climate deal that did not include the phasing out of fossil fuels has drawn widespread criticism from major players, highlighting enduring rifts on the international summit's final day. The document, published by the United Arab Emirates presidency of the climate summit, stressed the need to reduce emissions but did not call for the doing away of fossil fuels altogether. Scientists say fossil fuels are the single biggest factor contributing to potentially life-threatening climate change. Speaking to reporters, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged a deal at COP28 on the phase-out of fossil fuels, telling negotiators that now is the time for maximum ambition and maximum flexibility as UN climate talks in Dubai head into the home stretch. The UN chief delivered a clear message to government negotiators in which he said, "We must conclude the conference with an ambitious outcome that demonstrates decisive action and a credible plan to keep 1.5 degrees goal alive, protecting those on the front lines of the climate crisis."
We are in a race against time. As I said at the opening of COP28, our planet is minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit, and the clock keeps ticking. COP28 is scheduled to wrap up tomorrow, but there are still large gaps that need to be bridged. Now is the time for maximum ambition and maximum flexibility. Ministers and negotiators must move beyond arbitrary red lines, entrenched positions and blocking tactics. It's time to go into overdrive, to negotiate in good faith and rise to the challenge set by COP President Dr. Sultan Ahmed Al-Jaber.
Mr. Guterres warned of humanity's race against time as our planet is minutes to midnight for the 1.5 degree limit, referring to one of the keystone global warming targets set by the 2015 Paris Agreement. Negotiators are engaged in intense negotiations to hammer out a deal on key agenda items, including the future of the use of fossil fuels, ramping up renewable energy, building resilience to climate change, and ensuring financial support for vulnerable countries.
It's time to seek compromise for solutions without compromising on the science or compromising on the need for the highest ambition. In our fractured and divided world, COP28 can show that multilateralism remains our best hope to tackle global challenges. Specifically, I ask parties to ensure maximum ambition on two fronts. First, ambition on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Second, ambition on delivering climate justice. The global stocktake must offer a clear plan for a tripling of renewables, a doubling of energy efficiency, and a single-minded focus on tackling the root cause of the climate crisis: fossil fuel production and consumption.
At the first formal meeting of the closing plenary, COP28 President Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber said the time for discussion on a final document was coming to an end, adding that there is no time for hesitation.
We must deliver an outcome that respects the science and that keeps 1.5 within reach. When I stood here in front of you as the newly elected president, I asked you to approach this COP with a different mindset and to be cooperative. And I also asked everyone to be flexible. You showed exactly that mindset and that flexibility by taking the historic step of operationalizing the loss and damage on day one. Together, we have the opportunity to deliver history again. We can send a signal to the world that multilateralism does actually work, that this process can respond to what the science is telling us, that it can deliver for the most vulnerable and keep 1.5 within reach.
The United Nations-led summit known as COP28 was scheduled to end around midday after nearly 2 weeks of speeches, demonstrations and negotiations. Mariam.
The Security Council has strongly condemned the violence in South Sudan, in which dozens of people were killed since November. In a press statement, the members of the Security Council noted with grave concern the continued presence of some forces as well as armed elements of the local communities in Abyei, adding that it must be fully demilitarized without delay. Regarding the ongoing food crisis in the country, the spokesperson for the Secretary-General Stéphane Dujarric reported that the world cannot turn a blind eye to the extreme levels of food insecurity and malnutrition the world is now seeing in South Sudan.
Quick update across the continent from South Sudan, where the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs warns that more than half of the country's population is going hungry. An estimated 1.6 million children are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition through June of next year. OCHA says this year's humanitarian appeal to help 7.4 million people is just half funded, with about $1 billion only received to date. Meanwhile, humanitarians have been forced to halve rations and reduce support due to funding cuts. In a joint statement, the UN Famine Prevention Response Coordinator, Rina Galani, and the acting humanitarian coordinator for South Sudan, Martie-Hélène Vernet, said the world cannot turn a blind eye to the extreme levels of food insecurity and malnutrition we're now seeing in South Sudan.
That was the spokesperson for the Secretary-General Stéphane Dujarric. Back to you, Jamal.
And now a reminder of our top stories. Here in Algiers, the President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has received the Secretary-General of the Workers' Party, Louisa Hanoun. More air raids were carried out today by the Israeli occupation army against the Gaza Strip, and more precisely the territory's southern part, where thousands of civilians sought refuge. And negotiations at COP28 continue today with the hope that parties will deliver an ambitious agreement that sets the world on a path to a more sustainable future. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International. Next, our weekly broadcast, The Health Magazine with Mohamed Khatel.
Hello and welcome to this new edition of your weekly program, The Health Magazine, devoted today to the dire health situation prevailing in the occupied Gaza Strip on account of the ongoing Zionist attacks against innocent civilians and infrastructure. 500,000 Palestinians are at risk of hunger and thirst in cities where Israeli attacks continue, the Gaza municipality reported, describing the humanitarian situation as disastrous as the occupation army deliberately target food and water infrastructure. The municipality spokesman Husni Muhanna said that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is disastrous. He indicated that fuel shortages disrupted the process of evacuating the injured and transporting bodies, adding that the construction equipment and vehicles became unusable as a result of Israel's attacks. He stressed that water and food crisis in shelter centers is increasing exponentially as the number of people coming to these centers exceeds the capacity. In less than 60 days, the number of functioning hospitals has dropped from 36 to 18. Of these, 3 are only providing basic first aid, while the remaining hospitals are delivering only partial services. Those able to admit patients are delivering services well over their intended capacities, with some treating 2 to 3 times as many patients as they were designed for. The 12 hospitals that are still operational in the south are now the backbone of the health system. The World Health Organization (WHO) has expressed grave concern over the resumption of hostilities, including heavy bombardment in Gaza, and reiterates its appeal to Israel to take every possible measure to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, as stipulated by the laws of war. UNICEF, for its part, called the Gaza Strip the most dangerous place in the world for children, underlining that scores of children are being killed and injured on a daily basis. Entire neighborhoods where children used to play and go to school have been razed to the ground with no sign of life in them. Close to 1 million children in Gaza have been forcibly displaced from their homes, according to UNICEF. This week, more than a dozen member states of WHO submitted a draft resolution that urged Israel to respect its obligation under international law to protect humanitarian workers in Gaza. The text of the draft resolution was examined on Sunday during a special session of the WHO's Executive Board convened to discuss the health situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. It was proposed by Algeria, Bolivia, China, Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Malaysia, Morocco, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Palestinian representatives have WHO observer status and were also signatories to the proposal. The member states expressed their grave concern about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East al-Quds, especially the military operations in the Gaza Strip. They called for Israel to respect and protect medical and humanitarian workers exclusively involved in carrying out medical duties, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. Separately, WHO spokesman Christian Lindmeier told reporters on Friday that Gaza's health system was on its knees and could not afford to lose any other ambulance or a single hospital bed. Meanwhile, several aid charities have sounded the alarm about an apocalyptic situation in Gaza after more than 2 months of war, warning of starvation and an outbreak of infectious diseases. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres rang the alarm concerning the serious violation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, notably in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. In his address to the UN Security Council during the extraordinary session on the vote of a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and which was vetoed by the US, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned against the total collapse of the UN humanitarian support system in Gaza.
There is a high risk of the total collapse of the humanitarian support system in Gaza, which would have devastating consequences. We anticipate that it would result in a complete breakdown of public order and increased pressure for mass displacement into Egypt. I fear the consequences could be devastating for the security of the entire region. We have already seen the spillover in the occupied West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. There is clearly, in my view, a serious risk of aggravating existing threats to the maintenance of international peace and security.
Guterres also evoked the dire security situation prevailing in the occupied territories and Gaza in particular, posing great threat to the UN personnel and killing a large number of them in the history of the UN organization.
The risk of collapse of the humanitarian system is fundamentally linked with the complete lack of safety and security for our staff in Gaza and with the nature and intensity of military operations which are severely limiting access to people in desperate need. The threat to the safety and security of United Nations staff in Gaza is unprecedented. More than 130 of my colleagues have already been killed, many with their families. This is the largest single loss of life in the history of our organization. Some of our staff take their children to work so they know they will live or die together.
The UN Secretary General drew the attention of the UN Security Council about the ordeal the Palestinians are going through and called for urgent actions to be taken to relieve their sufferings and secure a permanent ceasefire.
The people of Gaza are looking into the abyss. The international community must do everything possible to end their ordeal. I urge the Council to spare no effort to push for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire for the protection of civilians and for the urgent delivery of life-saving aid. While we deal with the current crisis, we cannot lose sight of the only viable possibility for a peaceful future, a two-state solution on the basis of United Nations resolutions and international law, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. This is vital for Israelis, Palestinians, and for the international peace and security. The eyes of the world and the eyes of history are watching. It's time to act, and I thank you.
In his daily brief, the UN Secretary General spokesperson Stefan Dujarric deplored the worsening situation in the Palestinian occupied territories, deploring the insufficient aid that is funneled into the Gaza Strip.
The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs tells us that last night, 69 trucks carrying humanitarian supplies and 61,000 liters of fuel entered Egypt from Gaza. These quantities are nowhere near sufficient to meet overwhelming humanitarian needs in Gaza, not to mention that the complex lack of safety in Gaza is severely limiting access to people in need. Rafah was the main governorate in Gaza where limited aid distribution took place yesterday. In the adjacent Khan Yunis governorate, except for the delivery of medical supplies to 2 hospitals, aid distribution largely stopped due to the intensity of the ongoing hostilities. Also yesterday, the World Health Organization delivered trauma and emergency care supplies to the European Gaza Hospital and the Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis to cover the needs of some 4,500 hospital patients. This was the first delivery mission to those hospitals since November 29th, despite active hostilities ongoing in the area.
It is worth noting that the death toll from the merciless war Israel has waged against innocent and defenseless Palestinian civilians has surpassed 17,700, two-thirds of whom are women and children, according to the Health Ministry. And with this, we come to the end of this week's edition of your program, The Health Magazine. Do join us next week for a fresh edition with another health topic. Goodbye.